In the gleaming conference room of Morrison Industries, beneath the harsh glare of crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's annual salaries, CEO Richard Morrison sat at the head of a mahogany table that stretched like a dark river through the corporate sanctum. The table itself was a monument to excess, imported from sustainable forests in Brazil, and polished to mirror perfection by a team of specialists who arrived before dawn twice weekly. Around him, a constellation of assistants, advisors, and foreign clients from Europe and Asia formed a careful arrangement of power and hierarchy, each person's position in the room calculated to reflect their importance in the corporate ecosystem. The conference room occupied the entire northeast corner of the 42nd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city sprawling below like a conquered territory. The walls were lined with awards, certificates, and photographs, documenting Morrison Industries' rise from a small electronics startup to a regional manufacturing powerhouse. But today, those symbols of past success felt like accusations, silent witnesses to a moment that threatened to unravel decades of careful empire building. The fluorescent lighting, hidden behind custom fixtures that had been featured in Architectural Digest, cast sharp shadows across expensive suits and polished briefcases, creating an atmosphere so thick with tension that the very air seemed to pulse with the weight of millions. The climate control system hummed almost imperceptibly, maintaining the precise temperature that Morrison preferred, but even the perfectly regulated environment couldn't dispel the suffocating pressure that had settled over the room like a malevolent fog. They had prepared for this moment for an entire year, mobilizing teams of lawyers, accountants, engineers, and market analysts in a carefully orchestrated campaign that had consumed millions of dollars and countless hours of preparation. The contract sprawled across the table like a battlefield map, its 137 pages representing territories to be conquered, markets to be claimed, and profits to be extracted from 3 continents. Each clause had been negotiated, revised, and refined through months of preliminary discussions, each signature potentially worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. This was the deal that would cement Morrison Industries' transformation from a successful regional manufacturer into a genuine international powerhouse, a player in the same league as the multinational corporations that had once seemed impossibly distant. The agreement involved not just the sale of electronic components, but the establishment of joint manufacturing facilities in Germany and South Korea, technology sharing arrangements that would give Morrison access to cutting-edge research and development, and distribution networks that stretched from the industrial centers of Europe to the emerging markets of Southeast Asia. The financial projections were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that the partnership would generate $200 million in revenue within the first 3 years, with the potential to triple that figure as the international networks matured. Morrison had already begun planning the expansion of his headquarters, envisioning additional floors filled with international sales teams and regional managers who would oversee his growing empire. But fate, as it often does to those who assume their success is inevitable, had prepared a cruel twist that would expose the fundamental weaknesses hiding beneath Morrison's carefully constructed facade of corporate invincibility. The lead translator, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a 63-year-old veteran of international diplomacy who commanded fees of $3,000 per day, had called in sick that very morning at 6:45 a.m. His voice, hoarse with what he claimed was severe food poisoning from a trendy sushi restaurant, barely managed to convey his apologies through a series of painful coughs. Morrison had listened to the voicemail message with growing horror, understanding that Zimmermann's absence would leave him dependent on backup arrangements that had never been properly tested under pressure. The backup translator, a nervous young man named David Peters who had graduated from State University just 8 months earlier, had arrived 24 minutes late, his shirt already dampened with perspiration from his frantic rush through downtown traffic. Peters specialized in written translation, the careful, methodical work of converting documents in the quiet sanctuary of his basement office. Real-time interpretation, especially in high-stakes business negotiations where every nuance could shift millions of dollars, represented a completely different skill set that he had never fully developed. Already, in just the first 90 minutes of what was supposed to be a triumphant negotiation, Peters had committed a series of catastrophic errors that would have ended most people's careers on the spot. He had mistranslated the German delegation's opening remarks about quality control standards, making it sound as if they were questioning Morrison Industries' manufacturing capabilities, rather than praising them. When the Japanese representatives explained their company's philosophy of long-term partnerships, Peters had somehow transformed their respectful inquiry about corporate values into what sounded like a demand for immediate financial concessions. Each mistake created ripple effects that spread through the room like cracks in ice. The European delegates, led by the formidable Frau Weber whose steel-gray eyes missed nothing, had begun exchanging glances that carried decades of experience in reading the subtleties of international business. the Japanese representatives, guided by the elderly and dignified Mr. Tanaka, whose reputation for fairness was legendary throughout East Asian business circles, maintained their composure with the practiced discipline of people accustomed to navigating complex cross-cultural negotiations, but their growing concern was evident to anyone who understood the subtle language of diplomatic body positioning. Morrison's face had progressed through a spectrum of colors, from its usual pale corporate tan to a deep shade of burgundy that matched his Italian leather chair. His knuckles, adorned with a platinum wedding ring and a college-class ring from Yale, had turned bone white as he gripped the edge of the custom-built conference table hard enough to leave permanent impressions in the wood. The carefully maintained composure that he wore like armor in board meetings and shareholder presentations had begun to crack, revealing the volatile temperament that his subordinates had learned to fear during their weekly staff meetings. "Incompetent fools, every last one of you," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the acoustic-treated walls that had been designed to contain sound but seemed powerless to contain his rage. The words carried the full weight of his frustration, but also something deeper and more disturbing. The casual cruelty of someone who had never learned to see other people as fully human. Does nobody in this entire company understand what these people are saying? I'm surrounded by idiots who can't even handle basic communication. His eyes swept the room with the contempt of a feudal lord surveying peasants who had failed to properly tend his fields. Each glance was a calculated dismissal of human worth, a reminder that in Morrison's universe, people existed primarily to serve his ambitions or to absorb blame when those ambitions were threatened. His assistant, Jennifer Walsh, a competent woman in her 30s, who had sacrificed her own career ambitions to manage Morrison's impossible schedule, shrank back in her chair, as if trying to become invisible. The marketing director, a Yale MBA, named Thompson, who had once harbored dreams of running his own company, stared at his hands with the defeated expression of someone who had learned that corporate success often required the surrender of basic human dignity. The foreign delegates observed this display with the careful attention of experienced negotiators who understood that a business partner's character under pressure revealed everything about their reliability in long-term relationships. Frau Weber's expression had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed distaste, while Mr. Tanaka's face maintained its diplomatic neutrality, even as his dark eyes registered every detail of Morrison's behavior for future reference. Outside in the marble-clad lobby that served as Morrison Industries' temple to corporate success, a young black woman named Maya Johnson had just completed the careful arrangement of several insulated bags containing the executive lunch order on the Italian granite reception desk. She wore the simple navy blue uniform of Quick Bite Delivery, a local restaurant chain that specialized in high-end corporate catering, her company badge identifying her as employee number 743 in a workforce that most people never bothered to see as individuals. Maya's uniform was clean and professionally pressed, a point of pride that reflected her grandmother's teachings about dignity and self-respect, even in circumstances that others might consider beneath notice. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun that met the company's grooming standards, and her posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood her own worth regardless of how others chose to perceive her. At 24 years old, she possessed the kind of composed intelligence that academic counselors had once predicted would take her far in life, before economic reality had intervened with its harsh lessons about the relationship between dreams and financial necessity. The security guard stationed at the reception desk was a man in his 50s named Robert Johnson, whose 15 years of experience had taught him to categorize people quickly and efficiently. Maya fell into the category of service workers, who were necessary but forgettable, people who performed essential functions but who weren't expected to possess thoughts, opinions, or capabilities beyond their designated roles. He had brushed past her with the casual indifference that had become second nature, treating her presence as he might treat a piece of furniture that temporarily occupied space in his domain. But Maya's relationship with languages had begun long before she had ever imagined herself wearing a delivery uniform or navigating the service entrances of corporate headquarters. As a child growing up in a working-class neighborhood, where Spanish-speaking families lived next door to Francophone immigrants from Haiti and West Africa, she had absorbed multilingual conversations as naturally as other children learned playground games. Her elementary school teachers had recognized her gift early, recommending her for advanced language programs that her mother had somehow managed to afford through a combination of scholarships, part-time jobs, and sacrifices that Maya didn't fully understand until years later. By high school, Maya had become fluent in French and Spanish, with a growing facility in Japanese that she pursued through online courses and conversation groups at the local community college. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had encouraged her to apply for international relations programs at prestigious universities, painting pictures of diplomatic careers. and international business opportunities that seemed as distant and magical as fairy tales to a girl whose mother cleaned office buildings at night to pay the rent. Richard Morrison had built his empire on the foundation of his own assumed superiority, a worldview that had been carefully cultivated through decades of privilege and reinforced by a business culture that rewarded aggression and dismissed vulnerability as weakness. The son of Harold Morrison, a successful real estate developer who had built shopping centers throughout the southeastern United States, Richard had never known the grinding anxiety of financial insecurity or the humbling experience of depending on others for basic necessities. His childhood had been spent in gated communities where diversity was limited to different makes of luxury vehicles, and his adolescence had unfolded in private schools, where connections mattered more than character, and where academic achievement was often less important than social pedigree. His path to corporate leadership had been paved with opportunities that he had learned to treat as natural entitlements rather than extraordinary privileges. Yale University, where his family's donations had created a scholarship fund bearing the Morrison name, had provided him with an Ivy League credential and a network of contacts whose fathers owned banks, law firms, and manufacturing companies. His MBA from Wharton had been financed without student loans, allowing him to graduate debt-free and accept unpaid internships at prestigious consulting firms that less privileged students couldn't afford to consider. Morrison's corner office, situated 3 floors above the conference room where his international partnership was now threatening to collapse, served as a temple to his accumulated achievements and inherited advantages. The walls displayed diplomas from institutions that cost more per year than most people earned, photographs of him shaking hands with senators and corporate celebrities whose campaigns his family had supported, and awards from business organizations that had recognized his success without examining the foundations upon which that success had been built. But Morrison's accumulation of wealth and status had come with psychological costs that he had never bothered to calculate and wouldn't have recognized if they were presented to him in spreadsheet form. Years of having every door opened by subordinates, every obstacle removed by assistants, every criticism deflected by lawyers and public relations specialists, had calcified his capacity for empathy into something resembling marble. Beautiful from a distance, but cold and brittle under pressure. He had learned to see people in simple, utilitarian terms that reflected the business school case studies that had shaped his thinking during his formative years. Employees were resources to be deployed efficiently, customers were revenue streams to be maximized, and competitors were obstacles to be eliminated or acquired. The woman delivering lunch to his headquarters building was invisible to him not because of conscious malice, but because she represented a function rather than a human being. As forgettable as the cleaning crew that maintained his office after hours or the maintenance workers who kept his building systems running smoothly. Morrison's prejudices were not the crude bigotries of earlier generations, but rather the sophisticated blindness of someone who had learned to mistake privilege for merit, and to assume that success was always earned rather than inherited. He genuinely believed that his position at the top of the corporate hierarchy reflected his superior intelligence, work ethic, and leadership capabilities, rather than acknowledging the role that family wealth, social connections, and systemic advantages had played in his rise to power. This worldview had served him well in environments where everyone shared similar backgrounds and assumptions, but it had also created blind spots that threatened to undermine him when he encountered people whose talents didn't come packaged in familiar forms. The international business community that Morrison was now attempting to join operated according to different rules, where cultural sensitivity and genuine respect for diversity weren't just moral imperatives but practical necessities for successful partnerships. Maya Johnson had a different story entirely. 3 years ago, she had been a college junior studying international relations, spending summers in Montreal perfecting her French, taking online courses in Japanese, and dreaming of a career in diplomacy. Her professors had praised her linguistic gifts, her ability to not just translate words, but to capture the subtle nuances of meaning that could make or break international negotiations. But dreams, as Maya had learned, were luxuries that poverty rarely afforded. When her grandmother fell ill and medical bills began to pile up like autumn leaves, Maya had to make a choice. She dropped out of school, taking the first job that offered immediate income, delivering food for QuickBite, a local restaurant chain. Her linguistic skills, honed through years of study and natural talent, had become nothing more than a pleasant way to surprise the occasional foreign customer. Today's delivery to Morrison Industries was supposed to be routine. The order was large enough to require careful handling, but Maya had carried bigger loads. She had arrived at the gleaming corporate headquarters, passed through security with her temporary visitor's badge, and made her way to the reception area. The building itself was a monument to wealth and power, all marble floors and soaring ceilings that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. The crisis that was now unfolding in Morrison's conference room had been building for hours like a slow-motion earthquake, each mistranslation creating new fractures in the foundation of trust that international business partnerships required. Peters, the overwhelmed backup translator, represented everything that was wrong with Morrison's approach to building his business empire: the assumption that competence could be purchased at the last minute, that expertise was interchangeable, and that professionals with fundamentally different skill sets could substitute for one another without consequences. Written translation, Peters' area of expertise, was a contemplative discipline that allowed for careful research, multiple revisions, and consultation with reference materials. The translator could spend hours crafting the perfect phrase, consulting dictionaries and cultural guides, to ensure that every nuance was preserved and every potential misunderstanding was eliminated. It was intellectual work that rewarded precision and patience, skills that Peters had developed through years of solitary practice in his home office. Real-time interpretation, the skill that was desperately needed in Morrison's conference room, required a completely different set of abilities that couldn't be acquired through academic study alone. Simultaneous interpretation demanded the mental agility to process complex ideas in one language while simultaneously expressing them in another, all while maintaining awareness of cultural contexts, diplomatic subtleties, and the emotional undercurrents that could shift the entire tenor of a negotiation. It was performance art as much as intellectual exercise, requiring confidence, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to think clearly under intense pressure. The European delegation had arrived at Morrison Industries with expectations shaped by their experience working with major international corporations. Frau Weber, who served as the lead negotiator for the German consortium, had spent the previous evening reviewing cultural briefings about American business practices and had prepared talking points designed to emphasize her group's commitment to long-term partnerships built on mutual respect and shared technical excellence. Her opening remarks had been carefully crafted to acknowledge Morrison Industries' reputation while establishing her own delegation's credentials as serious, reliable partners. Peters had somehow transformed her diplomatic praise into what sounded like backhanded criticism, suggesting that the German delegation questioned Morrison Industries' quality control procedures rather than commending them. The mistranslation had created an immediate chill in the room, causing Frau Weber's eyebrows to rise in surprise, and Morrison to respond defensively to criticism that had never actually been offered. The Japanese delegation's experience had been even more problematic. Mr. Tanaka, whose reputation for fairness and long-term thinking had made him a legendary figure in East Asian business circles, had begun the negotiations by explaining his company's philosophy of partnership as a form of extended family relationship. In Japanese business culture, this concept carried profound meaning that went far beyond simple commercial transactions. It implied mutual loyalty, shared responsibility for success and failure, and a commitment to maintaining relationships across multiple generations of leadership. Peters had reduced this nuanced cultural explanation to what sounded like a demand for immediate financial concessions and accelerated delivery schedules. Mr. Tanaka's expression of polite bewilderment had been subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with Japanese diplomatic conventions, and the other members of his delegation had begun exchanging glances that suggested growing concern about Morrison Industries' commitment to cultural sensitivity. Each successive mistranslation had created new layers of confusion and mistrust. Technical specifications had been mangled, delivery schedules had been misunderstood, and quality control standards had been completely misrepresented. What should have been a celebration of international cooperation had devolved into a diplomatic crisis that threatened to destroy months of preliminary negotiations and permanently damage Morrison Industries' reputation in international business circles. Morrison's response to the crisis had revealed everything about his character and leadership philosophy. Rather than accepting responsibility for inadequate preparation or acknowledging his own role in creating the situation, he had chosen to blame everyone around him with the reflexive cruelty of someone who had never learned to see failure as a learning opportunity. His verbal assault on Peters had been particularly brutal, delivered with the casual dismissal of human dignity that had become his standard operating procedure when facing challenges that couldn't be solved through intimidation or financial leverage. Morrison Industries had built its reputation on manufacturing precision electronic components for the automotive and aerospace industries, specializing in the kind of sophisticated sensors and control systems that required tolerances measured in microns and reliability standards that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The company's products were embedded in everything from luxury car navigation systems to satellite communication arrays, invisible but essential components that most consumers never saw but whose failure could have consequences ranging from minor inconvenience to major disaster. The international partnership that was now threatened by translation failures represented Morrison's carefully planned expansion into markets that could triple his company's revenue within 5 years. The European consortium brought access to the growing electric vehicle market, where Morrison's advanced battery management systems could command premium prices from manufacturers desperate to improve their products' efficiency and safety. The Asian partnership offered entry into the consumer electronics market, where the same precision engineering that served aerospace applications could be adapted for smartphones, tablets, and emerging technologies that hadn't even been invented yet. But perhaps more importantly, the partnerships represented validation of Morrison Industries' transformation from a regional supplier into a company that could compete with established international players. The contracts would provide access to research and development facilities in 3 countries, shared patents that could accelerate innovation cycles, and manufacturing partnerships that could reduce costs while improving quality. It was the kind of strategic alliance that business schools taught as the ideal model for 21st-century global commerce. The financial projections that Morrison's team had spent months preparing painted a picture of exponential growth that would justify the risks and investments required to establish international operations. Conservative estimates suggested $200 million in new revenue within 3 years, but the optimistic scenarios projected figures that could approach $1 billion as the partnerships matured and generated secondary opportunities in related markets. Maya had been arranging the delivery items with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to work quickly in corporate environments, where service workers were expected to be invisible and unobtrusive. But as she organized the receipts that would document her completed delivery, she couldn't help but notice the increasing volume and agitation of voices drifting from the conference room. Her linguistic training had taught her to pay attention to tonal patterns and emotional undertones, skills that allowed her to recognize stress and frustration even when she couldn't make out specific words. The French phrases she was hearing carried the formal politeness of diplomatic language under pressure, the kind of carefully controlled communication that international negotiators used when they were trying to maintain professionalism while expressing serious concerns. The Japanese voices were even more controlled, but Maya's ear detected the subtle shifts in honorific language that suggested growing discomfort with the proceedings. To someone unfamiliar with these languages, the conversations might have sounded calm and businesslike, but Maya recognized the warning signs of a negotiation in crisis. Her first instinct was to complete her delivery and leave the building as quickly as possible. Maya had learned through experience that service workers who lingered in corporate spaces were often viewed with suspicion, treated as if their continued presence might somehow contaminate the rarefied atmosphere of high-level business. But something about the linguistic patterns she was hearing made her pause, the same intellectual curiosity that had once driven her to spend hours in university language labs, analyzing the subtle differences between regional dialects and formal communication styles. The breaking point came when she heard Frau Weber's voice rise slightly above its usual diplomatic tone, speaking in rapid French that carried unmistakable frustration. Maya understood every word. The German delegate was explaining to her colleagues that the translation problems were making meaningful negotiation impossible, and that they might need to consider postponing the discussions until Morrison Industries could provide competent language services. Peters emerged from the conference room at that moment, his face pale and damp with perspiration, looking like a man who had just witnessed his career ending in spectacular fashion. He was muttering to himself in fragments that Maya couldn't help but overhear. "This is a disaster. They're speaking 3 different languages now, and I can't keep up with any of them. Morrison is going to fire me, and I'll never work in this industry again." Morrison's response to the crisis revealed everything about his character. Rather than accepting responsibility for the inadequate preparation, he had chosen to blame everyone around him. His assistants cowered under his verbal assault, his advisors maintained careful silence, and Peters looked as if he might faint from the pressure. The room had become a kingdom ruled by fear, where nobody dared to speak honestly about the situation they all recognized was spiraling beyond control. From her position in the lobby, Maya could hear Morrison's voice rising to new heights of indignation, his words carrying through the building's carefully designed acoustics like thunder rolling across a landscape. "This is a disaster," he was shouting, his voice cracking with the strain of controlled fury. "How am I supposed to run a global business when I'm surrounded by people who can't even handle basic communication? This company is filled with incompetent fools who wouldn't recognize excellence if it walked through the front door." The casual cruelty in Morrison's voice made Maya wince, not just because of its harshness, but because she recognized the familiar pattern of someone who had learned to blame others for problems of his own creation. She had encountered this type of personality before in various service jobs, people who demanded perfection while providing inadequate resources, who expected miracles from employees they treated with contempt, who measured their own worth by their ability to make others feel small and powerless. Maya understood the irony of the situation better than anyone in the building could have imagined. She had delivered to corporate headquarters dozens of times over the past 3 years, had observed the casual way that executives treated people they considered beneath their notice, had learned to navigate the unspoken hierarchies that governed interactions between different social classes. To Morrison and his corporate colleagues, she was just another service worker, as interchangeable and forgettable as any other function in their carefully organized world. They never bothered to wonder about the lives of people who brought them their food, cleaned their offices, maintained their buildings, or provided the countless services that kept their business empire running smoothly. Maya had grown accustomed to being treated as if she were invisible, to having conversations stop when she entered a room, to being discussed in the third person as if she weren't present. The executives lived in a bubble of privilege that made them blind to the talents, dreams, and dignity of those they automatically classified as their social inferiors. But Maya also understood something about languages and international communication that Morrison and his expensive consultants seemed to have missed entirely. Languages were not just collections of vocabulary words and grammatical rules that could be mechanically converted from one system to another. They were living expressions of culture, history, and worldview, carriers of subtle meanings and emotional undertones that could only be properly interpreted by someone who understood not just what was being said, but why it was being said and how it would be received by people from different cultural backgrounds. The German delegates weren't just interested in profit margins and delivery schedules. They valued engineering excellence, environmental responsibility, and the kind of long-term business relationships that their culture had built over centuries of international commerce. Their questions about quality control weren't criticisms or challenges. They were invitations from Morrison to demonstrate that he understood their commitment to precision and reliability. The Japanese representatives weren't simply negotiating contracts in the American style of adversarial bargaining. They were attempting to build relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of trust that could survive the inevitable challenges that any long-term partnership would face. Their references to family and loyalty weren't mere metaphors. They represented fundamental approaches to business that had sustained their companies through decades of economic uncertainty and cultural change. These subtleties were completely lost on someone like Morrison, who approached international business as just another arena for displaying his dominance and extracting maximum profit with minimum consideration for cultural sensitivity. His worldview was fundamentally transactional, focused on immediate results rather than sustainable relationships, and his treatment of his own employees demonstrated the contempt for human dignity that his potential partners were now witnessing firsthand. The moment of decision crystallized when Maya heard Frau Weber's voice rise with unmistakable frustration, switching from English to rapid German as she spoke to her delegation about the impossibility of conducting meaningful negotiations without proper translation services. Maya understood every nuance. Frau Weber was explaining that the repeated mistranslations were not just inconvenient but insulting, suggesting that Morrison Industries either didn't understand or didn't care about the cultural sensitivity that international partnerships required. Mr. Tanaka responded in careful French, a diplomatic courtesy that acknowledged their shared status as non-native English speakers, while excluding their American hosts from a conversation about their growing concerns. His words were measured and respectful, but Maya caught the undertone of disappointment that suggested the Japanese delegation was reconsidering whether Morrison Industries possessed the cultural competence necessary for successful international collaboration. Peters attempted to translate these exchanges, but his version transformed diplomatic concern into what sounded like direct criticism of American business practices, adding insult to injury and pushing the negotiation toward complete collapse. Maya could see the expressions of the foreign delegates shifting from frustration to something approaching contempt as they realized that their carefully worded diplomatic language was being mangled into crude accusations. Maya felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same intellectual excitement she had experienced in her university language labs, when she encountered particularly challenging translation problems. But this was more than academic interest. She was witnessing the destruction of something that could have been beautiful, watching cultural misunderstanding destroy opportunities for genuine international cooperation. The waste of it all made her angry in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She thought about her grandmother's medical bills, about her student loans, about all the practical reasons why she needed to keep her head down and avoid attracting attention in corporate environments where people like her weren't welcome. But she also thought about her professors who had praised her gift for bridging cultures, about the dreams she had sacrificed for family loyalty, and about the three languages flowing together in that conference room, like rivers that needed someone to help them find their common destination. The security guard, Robert Johnson, noticed Maya's prolonged presence in the lobby and approached her with the suspicious authority of someone who rarely had opportunities to exercise power over others. "You need to finish up and move along," he said, his tone carrying the assumption that service workers had no legitimate reason to linger in corporate spaces. This is a restricted area during business hours. Maya looked at him calmly, recognizing the type of petty officiousness that she had encountered countless times in her service jobs. I'm just completing the delivery paperwork, she said quietly, holding up her receipts as evidence of legitimate business purpose. But even as she spoke, she could hear the conversation in the conference room reaching a critical point, with Morrison's voice now competing with multiple languages being spoken simultaneously. Well, hurry it up, Johnson said, clearly enjoying his moment of authority over someone he considered beneath his station. We can't have delivery people hanging around during important meetings. But before Maya could respond, Peters burst through the conference room doors, his face ashen, and his hands trembling with the physical manifestations of professional panic. He looked like a man who had just watched his career disintegrate in real time, and his desperation was evident in every gesture and expression. This is a complete catastrophe, Peters said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone talking to himself to maintain sanity. They're speaking German, French, and Japanese all at the same time now, switching back and forth between languages faster than I can follow. Frau Weber is discussing technical specifications with her engineers in German while Mr. Tanaka is explaining cultural concepts in Japanese, and Morrison is demanding that I translate everything simultaneously. I can't do this. I'm not qualified for this level of interpretation. Maya listened to Peter's description of the linguistic chaos unfolding in the conference room. And she realized that her unique combination of skills might be exactly what the situation required. Unlike Peters, who specialized in careful written translation, Maya had spent years in multicultural environments where code switching between languages was natural and necessary. She had learned to follow conversations that jumped between different linguistic systems, to recognize when speakers were using their native languages for emphasis or cultural specificity rather than exclusion. More importantly, Maya understood that the real problem wasn't linguistic but cultural. The foreign delegates weren't trying to exclude Morrison from their discussions. They were trying to communicate complex ideas with the precision that their cultures valued, using their native languages when English proved inadequate for expressing subtle concepts. Peters was treating their multilingual communication as a problem to be solved, rather than recognizing it as a natural part of international negotiation. From inside the conference room, Morrison's voice exploded with renewed fury. Where is everyone? I need someone who can actually communicate with these people. This is supposed to be the most important day in my company's history, and instead, it's turning into a humiliating disaster. Maya looked toward the conference room, then at Peters, who was pacing in circles like a trapped animal, then at Johnson, who was watching the corporate drama unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing a car accident. She thought about the 3 years she had spent delivering food to buildings like this one, invisible and ignored by people who never bothered to wonder about her capabilities or dreams. But she also thought about Frau Weber's frustrated German, about Mr. Tanaka's dignified French, about the beautiful complexity of multilingual communication that was being reduced to confusion and hostility by cultural blindness and inadequate preparation. In that moment, Maya realized that she possessed something that no one else in the building seemed to have. The ability to see the situation from all perspectives simultaneously, to understand not just what was being said but what was being meant, and what was being lost in translation. Before Maya could respond, Peters emerged from the conference room, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked like a man who had just witnessed his own career ending in spectacular fashion. Behind him, the voices from the conference room had grown even louder, Morrison's rage now competing with what sounded like multiple languages being spoken simultaneously. This is a complete disaster, Peters muttered to himself, not noticing Maya or the security guard. They're talking in 3 different languages now, and I can't keep up with any of them. Frau Weber is speaking German to her assistant, the Japanese delegation is discussing something in Japanese, and Morrison is demanding that I translate everything at once. I'm about to lose my job. Maya felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in her college classes, when she encountered a particularly challenging translation. It was the intellectual excitement of bridging languages and cultures, of finding the precise words that could build understanding between people from different worlds. But she also felt something else. A growing anger at the waste of it all, at the way that Morrison's arrogance was destroying what could have been a successful partnership. From inside the conference room, Morrison's voice exploded with renewed fury. Where is everyone? I need someone who can actually communicate with these people. His words carried the desperation of a man who was watching his carefully planned success crumble before his eyes, but who was too proud to admit that his own failures had created the crisis. Maya looked toward the conference room, then at Peters, who was pacing in circles like a caged animal. She thought about her grandmother's medical bills, about her student loans, about all the reasons why she needed to keep her head down and avoid attracting attention. But she also thought about the three languages flowing together in that room like rivers seeking the sea, and about how simple it would be to help them find their common destination. The moment of decision came when Frau Weber's voice rose above the others, speaking in crisp, clear French. Maya understood every word. The German delegate was explaining to her colleagues that they would need to postpone the negotiations until Morrison Industries could provide proper translation services. The Japanese representative responded in equally clear French, agreeing that professional standards required professional support. Peters looked stricken. He turned toward the conference room as if about to deliver terrible news, but Maya stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear. Frau Weber is suggesting that the meeting be postponed until you can find a qualified translator. Mr. Tanaka agrees, and he's concerned that the delays might indicate deeper organizational problems." Peters stared at Maya as if she had just materialized from another dimension. Johnson, the security guard, looked equally stunned. But from inside the conference room, the conversation continued, and Maya found herself translating almost automatically, her voice growing slightly stronger as she found her rhythm. "Now Frau Weber is asking if anyone from Morrison Industries speaks German or French fluently. She's explaining that several key contract terms have specific legal meanings that require precise translation." Maya paused, listening as the Japanese delegate joined the conversation. "Mr. Tanaka is adding that the Japanese delegation brought technical specifications that need to be discussed with someone who understands both the language and the engineering concepts." Peters had stopped pacing, and was staring at Maya with a mixture of amazement and relief. But before he could respond, Morrison's voice thundered from the conference room. "I don't care what it takes. Find me someone who can make this deal happen." Maya felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a cloak. She could turn around, complete her delivery, and walk away from this corporate drama that had nothing to do with her real life. Or she could step into that conference room and remind everyone present that intelligence and capability weren't determined by job titles or expensive suits. The decision made itself with the sudden clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of genuine moral choice. Maya had spent 3 years accepting her invisible status in corporate America, learning to navigate spaces where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed, where her intelligence was assumed to be limited by her job title, and her potential was dismissed without consideration. But listening to the linguistic chaos, destroying what could have been a successful international partnership, she realized that invisibility was a choice as much as a circumstance. Maya straightened her shoulders, checked her watch to note the exact time for what she sensed would become a pivotal moment in her life, and walked toward the conference room with the measured pace of someone who had made a decision and would not be deterred from seeing it through. Behind her, Peters scrambled to follow, while Johnson watched with an expression that shifted from bewilderment to alarm, as he realized that his carefully maintained corporate order was about to be disrupted by someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. The conference room fell into stunned silence as Maya entered, her quick-bite uniform stark against the expensive suits and tailored dresses that represented the corporate elite's standard attire. Morrison sat at the head of the table like a king whose kingdom was crumbling around him, his face flushed with the deep red of barely controlled rage and public humiliation. His expensive suit, custom-tailored to project authority and success, seemed to hang differently on him now, as if the fabric itself recognized that his carefully constructed image was unraveling in real time. The European and Asian delegates looked up with the polite curiosity of experienced international negotiators who had learned to recognize when unexpected elements entered complex situations. Frau Weber's steel-gray eyes, which had been flashing with frustration moments earlier, now showed the analytical attention of someone evaluating a new variable in a diplomatic equation. Mr. Tanaka maintained the composed expression that decades of international business had taught him to wear during uncertain moments, but Maya could see the subtle shift in his posture that suggested heightened attention. Morrison's staff watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear for Maya's presumption and secret hope that someone might actually be able to solve the crisis that was destroying their carefully planned international expansion. Jennifer Walsh, Morrison's long-suffering assistant, looked as if she were holding her breath, while Thompson, the marketing director, seemed torn between professional panic and grudging admiration for Maya's courage in challenging the corporate hierarchy. Maya had never felt smaller or more conspicuous in her life, but she had also never felt more certain of her purpose or more aware of her own capabilities. She looked directly at Morrison, meeting his furious gaze with the calm confidence of someone who understood both her own worth and the value of what she was offering, and spoke in a clear, professional voice that carried easily through the acoustically designed conference room. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her words measured and respectful, but carrying an undertone of authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. I believe I can help resolve your translation difficulties. I'm fluent in French, German, and Japanese, and I have experience with international business communication. The room erupted with the explosive force of a carefully contained system suddenly relieving pressure. Morrison's eyes widened with disbelief and fury, his face cycling through shades of red that would have concerned a medical professional. Several of his assistants gasped audibly, while others exchanged glances that ranged from shock to barely suppressed hysteria. "What is this?" Morrison demanded, his voice climbing toward the upper registers of outrage as he struggled to process the unprecedented challenge to his authority. "Who authorized delivery personnel to enter my conference room? Who gave you permission to interrupt the most important negotiation in my company's history?" His gaze swept over Maya's uniform with the dismissive efficiency of someone cataloging something beneath his notice, each glance designed to reduce her to her job title, and nothing more. "Security," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Remove this person immediately. I will not have my international partners witness this kind of unprofessional disruption." His hands were shaking now, not just with anger, but with the deeper psychological tremors of someone whose worldview was being challenged in ways he couldn't comprehend or control. But Frau Weber held up a manicured hand, her gesture carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected in international business circles. She spoke in crisp French, her words carrying the diplomatic weight of someone who had navigated complex negotiations across multiple continents and understood that competence often emerged from unexpected sources. Maya responded without hesitation, her translation flowing smoothly from Frau Weber's French into precise English that captured not just the literal meaning but the cultural undertones that had been lost in Peter's earlier attempts. "Frau Weber is asking whether I'm the qualified translator you mentioned earlier, Mr. Morrison. She says she's willing to test my abilities before the delegation proceeds with any further discussions. She notes that professional competence is more important than professional appearance in international business relationships." The silence that followed Maya's translation was so profound that the room's climate control system seemed to hum with unusual prominence. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while his advisors exchanged glances that ranged from panic to fascination. Jennifer Walsh looked as if she were witnessing either a miracle or a catastrophe, and couldn't decide which, while Thompson leaned forward in his chair with the expression of someone watching a theatrical performance whose ending he couldn't predict. Mr. Tanaka leaned forward slightly, his experienced eyes studying Maya with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades learning to recognize competence regardless of its packaging. When he spoke, his Japanese was rapid and sophisticated, the kind of complex business language that included cultural references, technical terminology, and subtle honorific distinctions that would challenge even experienced professional interpreters. Maya listened with the focused attention of someone whose mind was fully engaged with intellectual challenge, occasionally nodding to show she was following the flow of his reasoning. When he finished, she responded in equally fluent Japanese, her pronunciation reflecting not just academic study but genuine cultural understanding. Her response included appropriate levels of respect and formality, demonstrating that she understood not just what Mr. Tanaka had said but the cultural context that shaped how he had chosen to say it. Then, turning to address the entire room, Maya provided a translation that revealed the depth of her linguistic and cultural competence. Mr. Tanaka was explaining the technical specifications for the electronic components his consortium requires, including the quality control standards that are mandatory for all their international partnerships. He referenced the Japanese concept of monozukuri, the art of making things with pride and dedication to perfection, and wondered whether Morrison Industries shares this philosophy of craftsmanship excellence. He also mentioned the cultural importance of harmony in business relationships, and expressed hope that this negotiation could establish the kind of long-term partnership that honors both companies' commitment to mutual respect and shared success. He noted that his delegation brought detailed technical drawings and specifications that need to be discussed with someone who understands both the language and the underlying engineering concepts. Maya's translation was more than linguistic conversion, it was cultural interpretation that revealed the true intentions behind Mr. Tanaka's words. Rather than the demanding, aggressive negotiation tactics that Peters had described, Mr. Tanaka was actually offering collaboration, technical expertise sharing, and the kind of respectful partnership that could benefit both companies for decades. Frau Weber smiled for the first time since entering the Morrison Industries building, her expression transforming from diplomatic courtesy to genuine warmth as she recognized someone who understood the subtleties of international communication. She launched into a stream of German that included technical terms, legal concepts, and cultural references that would challenge even seasoned professional translators, speaking with the rapid fluency of someone testing the limits of Maya's capabilities. Maya listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification in perfect German when Frau Weber referenced specific European Union regulatory requirements or technical standards that required precise understanding. Her questions demonstrated not just linguistic ability but substantive knowledge of international business practices, regulatory frameworks, and the complex legal requirements that governed cross-border technology partnerships. When Maya provided her English translation, she captured not just Frau Weber's words but the underlying meaning and cultural context that transformed a complex technical discussion into clear, actionable business strategy. Frau Weber is explaining that her consortium is prepared to offer Morrison Industries access to advanced manufacturing techniques that could reduce production costs by 15 to 20% while improving quality control standards. She's also discussing the possibility of joint research and development initiatives that would allow both companies to share technological advances and patent protections. However, she emphasizes that these partnerships require what she calls Vertrauenswürdigkeit, trustworthiness that extends beyond simple contractual obligations to include cultural sensitivity and genuine respect for international business practices. She's concerned that the translation difficulties earlier today might indicate deeper organizational issues that could affect long-term collaboration. The atmosphere in the conference room began to shift like weather changing from storm to sunshine. The foreign delegates looked increasingly impressed and engaged, while Morrison's staff watched with growing amazement as the negotiation that had seemed destined for disaster was transformed into productive dialogue. Peters slumped in his chair with visible relief, his earlier panic giving way to the exhausted gratitude of someone who had been rescued from professional catastrophe. Morrison found himself experiencing psychological whiplash as he watched the most important negotiation in his company's history being conducted by someone he had initially tried to have removed from the building. His carefully constructed self-image as the indispensable leader, the corporate visionary whose personal involvement was essential for success, was being systematically dismantled by Maya's demonstration of capabilities that none of his expensive staff possessed. "How is this possible?" Morrison demanded, his voice now carrying confusion along with anger as he struggled to reconcile Maya's obvious competence with his assumptions about service workers and social hierarchies. "You're a delivery person. You can't possibly have this level of education or professional training." Maya met his gaze steadily, her expression reflecting the calm dignity of someone who had faced this kind of disbelief countless times throughout her life. She had learned to recognize the cognitive dissonance that occurred when people encountered evidence that contradicted their comfortable prejudices, the psychological resistance that prevented them from acknowledging talent when it appeared in unexpected packages. "Languages don't respect job titles, Mr. Morrison," she said simply, her words carrying quiet authority that seemed to fill the room despite their soft delivery. "And neither does intelligence. Perhaps we should focus on completing your negotiation rather than discussing my qualifications." The response revealed everything about Maya's character: her refusal to be diminished by others' limitations, her professional focus on practical solutions rather than personal validation, and her understanding that competence spoke louder than credentials in situations that truly mattered. She had no interest in engaging Morrison's prejudices or educating him about the complex circumstances that had led her to delivery work. Her priority was demonstrating through action that his assumptions about human worth and capability were fundamentally flawed. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that conference room had ever witnessed, a masterclass in international communication that revealed how much had been lost through the earlier translation failures. Maya facilitated a three-way discussion between the European and Asian delegates and Morrison's team, switching effortlessly between English, French, German, and Japanese, with the fluid grace of someone who thought naturally in multiple linguistic systems. But more importantly, she began to repair the cultural damage that had been inflicted by the morning's miscommunications. When Frau Weber expressed concerns about Morrison Industries' organizational capabilities, Maya translated not just the literal words but the underlying worry about partnership reliability, helping Morrison understand that the German delegate wasn't attacking his company but seeking reassurance about long-term stability. When Mr. Tanaka discussed the importance of mutual respect in business relationships, Maya helped Morrison recognize that the Japanese delegate wasn't imposing cultural requirements, but explaining the philosophical foundation that had made his company successful across multiple generations of leadership. The concept wasn't foreign or exotic, it was simply a different approach to the same business principles that Morrison claimed to value. As the discussion progressed, Maya discovered that the negotiation was far more complex and potentially lucrative than she had initially understood. The contract involved not just the sale of electronic components, but the establishment of joint research and development facilities that would give Morrison Industries access to cutting-edge technology developed in German and Japanese laboratories. Patent sharing agreements would allow all parties to benefit from innovations regardless of their origin, creating intellectual property portfolios that could generate revenue for decades. The financial implications were staggering. The German consortium was prepared to invest $40 million in upgrading Morrison Industries' manufacturing capabilities, while the Japanese partnership offered access to distribution networks that could reach emerging markets throughout Asia and the Pacific Rim. Conservative projections suggested that the combined partnerships could generate over $500 million in revenue within the first 5 years, with exponential growth potential as the international relationships matured. But perhaps most importantly, Maya helped the negotiating parties understand that they were discussing more than business transactions. They were creating the foundation for ongoing collaboration that would require trust, cultural sensitivity, and the kind of mutual respect that transcended simple commercial interests. The German delegation valued engineering excellence and environmental responsibility, principles that could enhance Morrison Industries' reputation and operational efficiency. The Japanese partnership emphasized long-term thinking and relationship building, approaches that could provide stability and growth opportunities that purely transactional business arrangements couldn't match. Maya found herself serving not just as a translator but as a cultural interpreter, helping Morrison understand concepts that his business school education had never addressed. When Mr. Tanaka explained the Japanese principle of Kaizen, continuous improvement through small, incremental changes, Maya helped Morrison see how this philosophy could be applied to manufacturing processes in ways that would reduce costs while improving quality. When Frau Weber discussed the German concept of Nachhaltigkeit, sustainability as a core business value, Maya translated not just the word but the comprehensive approach to corporate responsibility that could enhance Morrison Industries' market position. The power dynamics in the room underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation as the negotiation progressed. Morrison, who had begun the day as the undisputed authority figure commanding every aspect of the discussion, found himself increasingly dependent on Maya's skills and insights. The foreign delegates, who had been frustrated and considering departure just hours earlier, began to engage enthusiastically as communication barriers dissolved and genuine dialogue became possible. Morrison's staff, who had spent the morning in various states of panic and professional embarrassment, began to relax as they realized that their jobs and careers might be salvaged by Maya's intervention. Jennifer Walsh took careful notes as Maya facilitated discussions about implementation timelines and coordination procedures, while Thompson began to envision marketing campaigns that could leverage the international partnerships to enhance Morrison Industries' corporate image. But the most remarkable transformation was in the foreign delegates themselves. Frau Weber's stern professionalism softened into something approaching warmth, as she recognized that meaningful communication was finally possible. Mr. Tanaka's polite reserve gave way to enthusiastic engagement as he realized that Morrison Industries might actually possess the cultural competence necessary for successful international collaboration. The breakthrough moment came when Frau Weber raised a critical concern about intellectual property protections that had been completely misunderstood during the earlier translation attempts. Peters had interpreted her careful inquiries about patent safeguards as accusations of potential corporate espionage, nearly derailing the entire negotiation and creating diplomatic tensions that could have permanently damaged Morrison Industries' reputation in European business circles. Maya not only provided the correct translation, but helped Morrison understand that Frau Weber was actually offering to share proprietary technology as part of the partnership, contingent on establishing appropriate legal protections that would benefit both companies. The German consortium had developed advanced manufacturing techniques that could reduce production costs while improving product reliability, but they needed assurance that their innovations would be protected through comprehensive intellectual property agreements. Mr. Tanaka followed with a similar revelation, explaining through Maya's translation that the Japanese delegation was prepared to provide access to research and development facilities that had produced breakthrough technologies in semiconductor design and precision manufacturing. Their concerns weren't about restricting Morrison Industries' access to information, but about creating legal frameworks that would allow genuine collaboration without compromising any party's competitive advantages. As Maya facilitated these complex discussions, Morrison began to realize that what he was being offered was not just a business deal but an invitation into an international network of companies that had built their success on principles that were foreign to his confrontational, win-lose approach to commerce. These were organizations that measured success not just in quarterly profits but in decades-long relationships, companies that invested in their partners' success because they understood that mutual prosperity was more sustainable than competitive domination. The technical specifications that emerged from Maya's translations revealed opportunities that Morrison's team had never imagined. The German consortium's manufacturing innovations could be adapted to Morrison Industries' existing production lines with minimal capital investment, potentially reducing costs by 23% while improving quality control standards beyond anything Morrison had previously achieved. The Japanese partnership offered access to emerging markets where Morrison's products could command premium prices due to their association with internationally recognized quality standards. But perhaps most importantly, Maya helped Morrison understand that his potential partners were evaluating him not just as a business opportunity but as a cultural fit for long-term collaboration. His behavior during the morning's crisis, his willingness to blame others for problems of his own making, his dismissive treatment of people he considered beneath his status, his inability to recognize competence when it appeared in unexpected forms, had been noted and catalogued by experienced international negotiators who understood that character under pressure revealed everything about reliability in forms. Partnership. Frau Weber made this point explicitly during a discussion about quality control procedures, speaking in German that Maya translated with diplomatic precision. Frau Weber notes that successful international partnerships require leaders who can recognize and develop talent regardless of its source. She observes that companies that overlook capabilities in their own workforce are unlikely to maximize the benefits of international collaboration. Mr. Tanaka reinforced this theme with characteristic indirectness, explaining through Maya that the Japanese business philosophy emphasized the importance of ningen kankei, human relationships, as the foundation of all successful commercial ventures. Companies that treated employees as disposable resources, he suggested through carefully chosen metaphors that Maya translated with cultural sensitivity, were unlikely to sustain the kind of long-term partnerships that created genuine value for all stakeholders. Morrison found himself in the unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable position of being lectured about business philosophy by people he had intended to impress with his corporate success. His foreign partners were essentially suggesting that his management style, his treatment of employees, and his fundamental approach to human relationships were inconsistent with the values that international business communities considered essential for sustainable partnerships. Even more humiliating was the growing recognition that Maya, the woman he had initially dismissed as irrelevant, was not just facilitating the conversation, but actively contributing insights that improved the negotiation outcomes for all parties. When technical discussions grew complex, she asked clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the linguistic nuances and the underlying engineering concepts. When cultural misunderstandings threatened to create new problems, she provided context that helped all parties recognize their common interests rather than their surface differences. The climax of the negotiation arrived when all parties were finally ready to discuss specific contract terms, financial arrangements, and implementation timelines. Maya had spent hours building the cultural bridges that made detailed business planning possible, transforming what had begun as a diplomatic disaster into a collaborative problem-solving session that generated solutions none of the parties could have achieved independently. The financial projections that emerged were significantly more favorable than Morrison's original expectations. The combined partnerships would generate an estimated $650 million in revenue over the first 5 years, with growth trajectories that could approach $1 billion as the international networks matured and generated secondary opportunities in related markets. The joint research and development initiatives would provide access to technologies that could give Morrison Industries competitive advantages in multiple sectors, while the shared manufacturing capabilities would reduce costs and improve efficiency across all product lines. But the most significant transformation was in the structure of the partnerships themselves. Rather than the traditional supplier-customer relationships that Morrison had originally envisioned, the agreements that emerged were genuine collaborations that recognized all parties as equal partners with complementary strengths and shared interests in long-term success. Morrison stared at the preliminary contract terms with a mixture of triumph and profound discomfort. The deal was better than anything he could have achieved on his own, more comprehensive, and potentially more profitable than his most optimistic projections. But it had been made possible by someone he had initially tried to have removed from the building, someone whose talents he had been completely unable to recognize or value until they were demonstrated in ways that he couldn't ignore or dismiss. When Frau Weber stood to sign the preliminary agreement, she made a point of thanking Maya personally, speaking in formal German that conveyed the kind of respect typically reserved for senior diplomatic personnel. Maya's translation revealed the depth of the German delegates' appreciation. Frau Weber says that she has rarely encountered such skilled cultural interpretation in international negotiations. She notes that Maya's work today has created the foundation for what she hopes will become a model of successful transatlantic business collaboration. Mr. Tanaka followed with his own expression of gratitude, delivered in formal Japanese that included honorific language typically used for highly respected business partners. His words, as translated by Maya, carried similar weight. Mr. Tanaka expresses his sincere appreciation for Maya's professional excellence and cultural sensitivity. He says that her ability to bridge not just languages but worldviews has transformed what could have been a diplomatic failure into the beginning of a genuinely meaningful partnership. The signing ceremony that followed was a surreal experience from Morrison's perspective. He had achieved everything he had wanted, the international partnerships were secured, the financial projections exceeded his expectations, and Morrison Industries was positioned to become a genuine multinational corporation. But the victory felt hollow and complicated, tainted by the recognition that his success had been achieved despite his own limitations, rather than because of his leadership capabilities. His signature on the contract was just one of many, but Maya's contribution had been so central to the negotiation's success that both foreign delegations insisted on having her sign as a witness, acknowledging her role in creating the agreement. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. The woman Morrison had initially dismissed as beneath notice was now being recognized by international business leaders as an essential contributor to their success. As the delegations prepared to leave Morrison Industries, both Frau Weber and Mr. Tanaka made unexpected offers that would change Maya's life in ways she had never imagined possible. The German consortium invited Maya to serve as their American liaison, a position that would involve regular travel to Europe, coordination of cross-cultural business activities, and a salary that exceeded what Morrison paid most of his management staff. The role would include comprehensive benefits, continuing education opportunities, and the kind of international career development that Maya had once dreamed about during her university studies. The Japanese partnership extended an even more generous offer, including an invitation to complete her education through their corporate scholarship program, while working as a cultural consultant for their North American operations. The position would provide not just financial security but the opportunity to develop her career in international business, while finishing her degree with full corporate sponsorship. Maya listened to these offers with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the negotiation. Her composed response reflecting years of experience, managing her reactions to both disappointment and unexpected opportunity. She thanked both delegations graciously, expressing genuine appreciation for their recognition, while requesting time to consider her options. The measured dignity of her response impressed the international delegates even further, confirming their assessment of her character and professional potential. Morrison watched these exchanges with growing discomfort that bordered on panic. The woman he had dismissed as inconsequential was being courted by his new business partners, offered opportunities that exceeded anything he could provide, and recognized as a valuable professional resource by people whose respect he desperately wanted to earn. His own employees were looking at Maya with newfound respect, and he could see some of them wondering what other talents might be hiding among the people he routinely ignored or dismissed. The aftermath of the negotiation was almost as dramatic as the event itself. Word of Maya's linguistic abilities and professional performance spread quickly through Morrison Industries' corporate network, carried by employees who had witnessed the transformation of a diplomatic disaster into a business triumph. By the end of the week, she had received job offers from 3 other companies, including 2 that specialized in international business consulting and commanded premium fees for their services. Morrison found himself facing uncomfortable questions from his board of directors about his management practices and organizational development strategies. How had he failed to recognize such exceptional talent working within his own corporate ecosystem? What other opportunities was the company missing because of his narrow perspective on human resources and employee development? The success of the international partnership was undeniable, but the circumstances of its achievement had exposed fundamental flaws in Morrison's leadership approach that could no longer be ignored or rationalized. The quarterly board meeting following the negotiation was particularly uncomfortable for Morrison. He had to explain how a food delivery worker had saved the company's most important deal while his expensive consulting staff had failed to meet basic professional standards. The board members listened with expressions ranging from amusement to concern, and several of them asked pointed questions about Morrison's hiring practices, employee development programs, and his ability to recognize and develop talent throughout the organization. Catherine Sterling, the board's most senior member and a woman who had built her own business empire through careful attention to human capital development, was particularly direct in her assessment. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived and thrived in male-dominated industries for 4 decades, "this incident suggests that you may be operating with some rather significant blind spots when it comes to recognizing and developing talent. How do you plan to address this issue going forward?" Morrison's response was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, filled with phrases about comprehensive review processes, expanded talent recognition programs, and systematic approaches to human resource development. But the subtext was clear to everyone in the room. He had learned nothing from the experience, except that he needed to be more careful about his public image, and more strategic about managing situations that might expose his limitations. The breakthrough moment came when Frau Weber raised a concern about intellectual property protections. Peters had earlier mistranslated her questions as accusations of corporate espionage, nearly derailing the entire negotiation. Maya not only provided the correct translation but helped Morrison understand that the German delegate was actually offering to share proprietary technology as part of the partnership, provided that both sides could agree on appropriate protections. Mr. Tanaka followed with a similar offer from the Japanese consortium, contingent on establishing the kind of trust-based relationship that could only be built through clear, honest communication. Maya helped Morrison recognize that what he was being offered was not just a business deal but an invitation into an international network of companies that valued excellence and reliability above short-term profits. As the hours passed, Morrison's initial outrage began to give way to a more complex mixture of emotions. He was witnessing the successful completion of the most important negotiation in his company's history. But it was being achieved by someone he had trained himself not to see. Every successful translation, every cultural bridge that Maya built, served as an indictment of his own prejudices and assumptions. The foreign delegates, meanwhile, were clearly impressed not just with Maya's linguistic abilities but with her professionalism and cultural sensitivity. Frau Weber commented, in German, that Maya's translation style reminded her of the best diplomatic interpreters she had worked with. Mr. Tanaka noted, in Japanese, that Maya understood the subtle distinctions between formal and informal business language that many professional translators missed. But perhaps the most telling moment came when both delegations began directing their questions to Maya rather than to Morrison. They had recognized that she was not just a translator but a skilled communicator who could help them navigate the complexities of international business. Maya found herself explaining American business practices to the foreign delegates, while simultaneously helping Morrison understand the cultural contexts that shaped his international partners' expectations. The climax of the negotiation arrived when all parties were ready to finalize the contract terms. Maya had spent hours facilitating discussions about pricing, delivery schedules, quality standards, and intellectual property sharing. The document that emerged was significantly different from what Morrison had originally proposed. It was more collaborative, more respectful of all parties' concerns, and ultimately more profitable for everyone involved. Morrison stared at the contract with a mixture of triumph and humiliation. The deal was better than anything he could have achieved on his own, but it had been made possible by someone he had initially tried to have removed from the building. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room, particularly the foreign delegates, who had watched the entire drama unfold with increasing amusement. When Frau Weber stood to sign the agreement, she made a point of thanking Maya personally, in French, for her exceptional service. Mr. Tanaka followed suit, expressing his gratitude in formal Japanese, and noting that Maya's cultural understanding had helped create the foundation for what he hoped would be a long and prosperous partnership. The signing ceremony was a subdued affair from Morrison's perspective. He had achieved everything he had wanted, but the victory felt hollow. His signature on the contract was just one of many. Maya's contribution had been so central to the negotiation's success that the foreign delegates insisted on having her sign as a witness, acknowledging her role in creating the agreement. As the delegations prepared to leave, both Frau Weber and Mr. Tanaka made unexpected offers. The German consortium invited Maya to serve as their American liaison, a position that would involve regular travel to Europe and a salary that dwarfed her delivery job income. The Japanese partnership extended a similar offer, along with an invitation to complete her education through their corporate scholarship program. Maya listened to the offers with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the negotiation. She thanked both delegations graciously but asked for time to consider her options. She had entered the building that morning as an invisible service worker. She was leaving as someone whose talents had been recognized by international business leaders. Morrison watched these exchanges with growing discomfort. The woman he had dismissed as inconsequential was being courted by his new business partners, offered opportunities that exceeded anything he could provide. His own employees were looking at Maya with newfound respect, and he could see some of them wondering what other talents might be hiding among the people he routinely ignored. The aftermath of the negotiation was almost as dramatic as the event itself. Word of Maya's linguistic abilities and professional performance spread quickly through Morrison Industries. By the end of the week, she had received job offers from 3 other companies, including 2 that specialized in international business consulting. But Maya's response to her sudden fame revealed the same measured judgment she had displayed during the negotiation. She gave her notice to QuickBite, but instead of accepting any of the corporate offers, she decided to start her own translation and cultural consulting business. The contacts she had made during the Morrison Industries negotiation became her first clients, and her reputation for excellence in high-stakes international communication spread rapidly through professional networks. Morrison, meanwhile, found himself facing uncomfortable questions from his board of directors about his management practices. How had he failed to recognize such exceptional talent? What other opportunities was the company missing because of his narrow perspective? The success of the international partnership was undeniable, but the circumstances of its achievement had exposed fundamental flaws in Morrison's leadership approach. The quarterly board meeting following the negotiation was particularly awkward. Morrison had to explain how a food delivery worker had saved the company's most important deal while his expensive staff had failed to meet basic professional standards. The board members listened with expressions ranging from amusement to concern, and several of them asked pointed questions about Morrison's hiring and management practices. One board member, an elderly woman named Catherine Sterling, was particularly direct. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built her own business empire, "this incident suggests that you may be operating with some rather significant blind spots. How do you plan to address this issue going forward?" Morrison's response was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, full of phrases about comprehensive review processes and expanded talent recognition programs. But the subtext was clear to everyone in the room. He had learned nothing from the experience except that he needed to be more careful about his public image. Maya, meanwhile, was building a business that reflected everything Morrison claimed to value but had never actually practiced. Her client list grew to include international law firms, diplomatic organizations, and multinational corporations that needed someone who could navigate the complex intersection of language, culture, and business protocol. Her success was built on the same principles she had demonstrated during the Morrison Industries negotiation: exceptional skill, cultural sensitivity, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth regardless of how others chose to perceive her. She hired other linguists who had been overlooked by traditional corporate structures, creating a company that valued talent over pedigree and results over appearances. 6 months after the negotiation, Maya received an unexpected phone call from Morrison himself. His company was facing another international crisis, and his regular translation services were proving inadequate. He was calling to request her services, at whatever rate she deemed appropriate. Maya's response was polite but firm. Her consulting rates, she explained, had increased significantly since she had established her reputation. More importantly, her schedule was fully booked for the next 6 months with clients who had recognized her value from the beginning. She could recommend one of her associates who might be available for the project, but her own services were reserved for long-term partnerships with organizations that demonstrated mutual respect and collaborative values. Morrison ended the call with the hollow feeling of someone who had learned too late the cost of his prejudices. The woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice was now beyond his reach, her success built on the foundation of talents he had been too blind to see. The story of Maya Johnson and Richard Morrison became something of a legend in international business circles. It was told in business schools as a case study about the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. It was cited in diversity training programs as an example of how unconscious bias could cost companies millions of dollars and irreplaceable opportunities. But for Maya, the story was simpler and more personal. It was about the moment when she had chosen to step forward instead of stepping back, when she had claimed her place in a room where people like her weren't supposed to belong. It was about the discovery that her voice, her knowledge, and her dignity were not dependent on anyone else's recognition or approval. The conference room at Morrison Industries still hosts international negotiations, but the dynamics have changed subtly. The company has diversified its translation services and implemented policies designed to identify and develop talent throughout the organization. The changes were cosmetic rather than fundamental. Morrison himself remained largely unchanged, but they represented a grudging acknowledgement that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. Maya's office, 3 miles away in a converted warehouse that houses several small consulting firms, displays a framed photograph from that day at Morrison Industries. It shows her standing at the conference table, surrounded by international business leaders who had learned to respect her expertise. Her expression in the photo is calm and confident, the look of someone who has discovered that her worth was never in question, only her willingness to claim it. The deeper lesson of the story extends beyond corporate boardrooms and international negotiations. It speaks to the countless talents that remain hidden because society has taught us to look for excellence in familiar packages. It challenges the assumption that intelligence and capability can be measured by job titles and educational credentials. Most importantly, It reminds us that the most profound changes often begin with a single person's decision to speak up when everyone expects them to remain silent. Maya Johnson's delivery uniform hangs in her closet now, a reminder of where her journey began. She keeps it not out of nostalgia, but as a symbol of how little external circumstances reveal about internal worth. On difficult days, when clients challenge her expertise or competitors question her qualifications, she remembers the moment when she walked into that conference room and proved that respect must be earned, not assumed, and that it flows both ways across the artificial barriers that divide us from one another. The real victory was not in saving Morrison's deal or building her successful business. It was in the quiet moment when she recognized that her knowledge, her dignity, and her right to be heard were not dependent on anyone else's permission. In a world that often judges people by their appearance, their accent, or their job title, Maya Johnson had claimed her space and demanded to be seen for who she truly was: exceptional.